Really great to welcome everybody to the Statewide Biobank seminar series. This is our final seminar for 2023, but we'll be reconvening in 2024. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that the Statewide Biobank is located on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the very vital roles that Indigenous people play in all aspects of Australian society and recognise their very important connection to country. It is a really great pleasure and an honour to be welcoming Darren Saunders to speak for us today, and I'm sure Darren is probably known to many of you in many of his roles. So I think many of you will know that Darren's, has been a cancer biologist and worked in cancer and neuroscience here in Australia and North America for 20 years. He's joining in his not so new capacity now as New South Wales Deputy Chief Scientist and Engineer, where he's also the Executive Director of the Office of the New South Wales Deputy Chief Science and Engineer. And he's also an Associate Professor in Medical Sciences at the University of Sydney. So Darren has always been, I think if you were listening to our discussions around Twitter, Darren's always been a scientist who's really actively engaged with the public and who's thought very broadly around not only, how to do science, but how science affects, society. And he's worked with Liz Broderick and Co as a senior researcher advisor and a data expert into reviews into things like workplace culture, harmful behaviours and systematic discrimination in different sectors, things that are really important. And he's also been very vocal about some of these issues in science as well. Many of you will have heard Darren as a regular commentator on TV and radio, and he's the resident scientist on the ABC TV's The Drum program. And when he's not doing science, I know that Darren describes himself as a thalassophile, and I think that means that he's often in the sea.
Yes.
Swimming. Yes. Anyway, it is wonderful to have you here, Darren. Thank you very much. We look forward to hearing you tell us about building and supporting research ecosystems from your perspective, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for the lovely invitation. I might reflect on some of those aspects of the experience that I've had getting to this point and how that's informed the work that we do in this office, actually, because it's an interesting thing to reflect on. I'm going to talk about building and supporting research ecosystems. I'm going to use one particular example, which is incredibly relevant to hopefully most of the people on this meeting, because it is directly relevant to health and biomedicine. Before I start, I will also acknowledge the Gadigal people from whose lands I'm speaking to you today, and also the Bidjigal people from where I live. But I also really want to acknowledge the Barkindji people from far western New South Wales. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this talk today reflecting on a major piece of work that we've done in the office this year to understand why mass fish deaths keep happening in the Darling River out at Menindee. And it's an interesting insight into some of the work that we do in this office. But I think it's also been an incredible learning experience for everybody in this office to understand how the deep connection and understanding of natural ecosystems that exists among Aboriginal people of their own land, how that can influence Western thinking on science, if you like, and to spend some time in the space in between those two worlds has been a really deeply gratifying, equally disturbing, but ultimately a very strong learning experience for me and for the whole team here in the office. So I'll acknowledge that the Barkindji, they've been incredibly generous with their time and knowledge for me this year. So what I thought I would do, one thing I have learned since starting this job is that maybe some of the things we do in this office are not necessarily have a lot of visibility out there outside of government. So I thought I might spend just a little bit of time introducing what we actually do in the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of strategy and talk a little bit about framing research funding as an investment against future threats. And then I'm going to use some examples of some of the research ecosystems that we work on here and the things that we do to develop them. And really they cross all the boundaries, all the different research disciplines. And in fact, it's one of the best things about this job that I love is that, on any given day, I can be working on anything from RNA to dead fish to, hydrogen turbines. It really is a very broad spectrum of things that we cover in this office. And I want to talk about some recent data that we've collected on the impact of the work that we do. And then I'm going to use a specific example of the RNA ecosystem in New South Wales as an example of how we're trying to build and develop the research capacity in the state. So here's the sort of broad picture of what we do in the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer. And really our job is to enable the application of science, engineering and technology to improve the life of the citizens of New South Wales. And that's not just economic, that's environmental, social, health, all of the things that go to making up well-being. And we do that through a number of different ways. So, one of the main functions of our office is to offer independent advice to government. So we basically get thrown the difficult questions that cross different parts of government that are kind of difficult to deal with. There may not be a lot of evidence around on what to do about certain problems. And we deliver advice back to government on those. And I'll talk a bit more about that in detail in a minute. We provide a lot of research support, and that's direct funding of researchers directly, of infrastructure, conferences, and we do particular rounds of targeted investment. And again, I'll give some examples of that. And then we do a lot of work on industry development, and that's really kind of a networking function, I guess. We have a number of different ways of bringing together different spheres of the research world in New South Wales, whether that's, big business, startups, academia, different arms of government, and really trying to facilitate connections, I guess, as a way of developing industry. And then a key part of all of that is the science outreach and engagement work that we do. So that's looking at finding ways to connect science and scientists and engineers and technologists with community, really, and getting that two-way flow of information, and that's obviously something I'm passionate about and have been for a very long time, is talking about how science fits into society more broadly. And having that as a conversation, not as a broadcast. So not scientists going, here's what we know, shut up and listen. It's that two-way engagement, that two-way conversation that I think is really important. So we do a lot of work in that space as well, and we support a lot of things going on in that space throughout New South Wales. Forgive me if my slides are sometimes a little slow because my computer really hates driving Teams. So that might happen occasionally. Okay, so I'll just quickly give an example of the independent reviews. And this kind of sums up, the reason I like to talk about this is it kind of sums up a couple of important points about what we do. So we are very clearly in the space of providing evidence-based analysis. We rely heavily on experts. We're not experts in most of the topics that we work on, but within our office, for example, there are, I'm a biomedical scientist by training. We have people that are mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, nuclear physicists, people from social sciences, PhDs backgrounds. We have some people with legal experience. It really covers a very broad spectrum of specialties. But what that allows us to do is not to be experts in any one thing. Obviously, it allows us to know how to interrogate data and evidence, but what we do is bring a lot of expertise into the work that we do. So we form, expert panels. We ask experts to write scientific papers, for example, on particular bits of work that are quite specialized. And we also do a lot of community and stakeholder engagement. So a lot of the work that we do crosses over with various industries. A lot of the problems we get asked to solve have very deep connections to community. So some of the reviews that have come out of this office in the last few years will be on, for example, coal mining under the water catchment, bottled water production in New South Wales, fish deaths in Menindee, things, brumbies in Kosciuszko National Park, all of those things that are really very emotive. They have deep connections into community and often deep connections into industry. And we spend a lot of time consulting, listening and talking to all of those various stakeholders. And then we bring that together and we form a bunch of findings, essentially. We say, here's what we know about this situation. Here's what the evidence tells us. Here's our analysis of that evidence. Really importantly, and quite often, here's where the gaps are in that evidence. Often there's not data to support some of the things that we're looking to try and understand. And then off the back of those findings, we will often, but not always, make recommendations. And you'll see I've got a dotted line there across the line between recommendations and action. And we're very careful, and then sometimes a bit of a tightrope to walk, but we are very careful to draw a line in the sand and say, here's what the science says, here's the evidence, and here's the analysis. It's not our job to formulate policy. It's not our job to formulate strategy. We step back at that point and we let other people who are experts do the policy and do the strategy and take the action. And that's really what drives the impact. And I think that's a really important point. We don't want to overstep the mark here. Science plays a particular role in the formulation of policy. The formulation of policy is about balancing competing needs, whether it's money or limited resources, or, for example, water in the case of some of the work we've been doing recently. And they are inherently political and community-facing decisions. So what we really try to do is to provide an evidence base for those decisions and policies to be made. And we're very careful not to stick our nose into the policy part of it. And that helps to maintain our independence. It helps to maintain our authority in the space, I guess. Okay, so here's just a couple of examples of some of the things we've worked on. I'm going to talk a bit more about the fish deaths in a minute. We just released a huge study into decarbonisation innovation. So this is something we do every couple of years to really take a systematic look at what technology exists to get us towards carbon-free economy. What's the technology where New South Wales has an advantage, or what are the opportunities, and how might we go about exploiting those? We also do a regular assessment of our ability to keep the lights on in New South Wales. So we look at the energy market, we look at all the generators and the transmission systems, and we go and do stakeholder engagement and look at climate forecasts and things like that, and come up with basically an approach that lets the energy minister know whether or not we're likely to have any energy emergencies during hot weather or bushfires or floods or anything like that. So that's just a flavour of some of the things we've been working on. And the big example that I keep mentioning is this Menindee mass fish deaths event. So that is a picture of the Darling River in Menindee from the middle of March this year. What you're looking at there is a short stretch of the river, and all those white stuff is actually the carcasses of dead fish floating on the top of the river. So the residents of Menindee woke up on the 17th of March this year to find, we think, somewhere between 25 and 30 million dead fish floating on the river. And we're looking at about a 40-kilometre long stretch of river that looks like what you're seeing there. And so the impact of that is obviously huge, not just the visual and other impacts of having that many dead fish in one place, but obviously massive environmental impacts, huge health impacts. The people in Menindee derive their drinking water and the water they wash in from that river. They irrigate their crops with it. Had a huge social and economic impacts on the town, and it came on the back of an extended drought and a very extended flood. And so it was one of these classic wicked problems that kind of fits into the work that we do. And so we were asked to take a look at what might be causing those mass fish deaths, to take a look at what might be done to mitigate against them happening again, and to take a look at the associated emergency responses and what might be done better. So you can already see that's quite a broad spectrum of sort of scope of work, if you like. Just to orient you, here's the Menindee Lakes. They're a huge natural ephemeral lake system out in far western New South Wales, not far from Broken Hill. And essentially in the 50s and 60s, they were modified with some infrastructure to divert water from the Darling River into those lakes and then control the release of the water back out of those lakes for irrigation. And that's for use not just around Menindee and downstream, but also because it's part of the Murray-Darling, and it's a river system that impacts on 4 different states, or 5 different states if you include ACT. And so some of that water ends up in use in Victoria and South Australia as well. So it's a complex system. It's taken what we've discovered, what we've understood to be an incredibly important biological point in that river and cultural point in that river, and really heavily modified the flow of water. And that's had some significant effects over the years. And so, in a nutshell, this is an awful lot of work by an awful lot of people, but essentially what we found is that the fish were dying because they ran out of oxygen. And what was really instructive in this work is that I leant back heavily on my training in biochemistry and physiology, and essentially became an oxygen mass balance problem and a hemostasis problem, where the river contains a certain amount of oxygen. There are certain things that supply oxygen, certain things that take a demand on that oxygen, and various things that modify those supply and demand rates. And really, the entire piece of work around what caused it and how to mitigate against these effects boiled down to understanding it in that mass balance problem. And so, you have things like water flowing down the river, you have exchange with the atmosphere, and you have photosynthesis driving the supply of oxygen into the water column. And then things like sunlight and temperature and biomass and flow rate will all influence those. And then on the demand side, you have all the fish that are in the river, you have algae, you have biological demand in the sediment from microorganisms, and you have chemical modification of other elements in the water column, all of which drive demand on oxygen. And what we basically found is that at a key point, the climatic conditions or the weather conditions, the biological demand, i.e. the fish and the algae in the river, coupled with a decreasing inflow, caused a massive crash in the amount of oxygen that was available, and the fish all suffocated and died. And the really troubling thing is that all of those dead fish are now sitting on the bottom of that river decomposing, which is increasing the demand on the oxygen. We're moving into a drying phase, or we are in a drying phase, which means the inflows are down, and we're in a classic feed-forward system where it's probably very likely that we'll see another mass fish death over this summer when the conditions are right, which is quite a confronting thing to think about. And it's not immediately apparent that there's much we can do to stop it, which is also quite a confronting thing to think about. The really confronting thing is that what we really understood is that the fish are just a canary in the coal mine. And when you start to look at just about any species that's part of the ecosystem out there, they are all in decline. They have been in serious decline for some time. And it appears to be coincident with a decline in the patterns and the profiles of water flowing through the river. Reasons for that are complex. It's not a climatic effect. There's been no real significant difference in the amount of water that flows into this river, but the way it's being used by irrigators and other users upstream has significantly changed. And so we're seeing this sort of ecosystem collapse happening before our eyes, which means it's very difficult to fix. One of the other interesting things that often happens in the work that we do, we often find ourselves veering into the regulatory space or the legislative space. One of the things that I found most shocking about this report, I don't expect you to look at this in detail. This is a map that we did of all of the different arms of government that have some regulatory function across the way the water flows through that particular part of the Darling-Barker River. And I think we identified 18 different parts of government that have some say in that, whether it's local, state, federal. And what that means is things fall through the gaps, and there's crossovers between responsibilities. It's hard to make decisions. And so a lot of what's been going on is because it's just too complex, and a lot of the regulations and legislation that exist are very difficult to align with some of the decisions that are being made. So that was a major contributor to this as well. And so that helps to frame the sort of recommendations that we make around increasing supply and decreasing demand. And you know, that report's online. I won't bore you with the details, but really understanding the legislation, the regulation, understanding where the gaps are in monitoring and data that allows us to make timely decision making, and also who has the power for making those decisions, and then also the emergency management framework that exists when things do go wrong. So our recommendations are all framed around that sort of paradigm, if you like. And then some of the things we're working on at the moment. So we're looking at the way asbestos might be used in recovered building material and recovered fines. We're looking at road tunnel air quality. We're looking at a gas pipeline failure that happened up in Lithgow last year and what the underlying reasons for that were. We chair the PFAS committee for New South Wales, looking at the environmental and human impacts of PFAS. And we also chair the expert panel on the New South Wales koala strategy. So you can see it covers a very broad spectrum of work. Okay, that's enough about reviews, but it is an important part of what we do. And I think it's an interesting reflection on how someone from a biochemistry and molecular biology background can end up working on dead fish. But some of those sort of core scientific principles turn out to be quite useful in different fields. So I wanted to stop and talk for a moment about the importance of strategy. The work that we do in our office and across government more broadly in terms of engaging with science and research is guided by the New South Wales 20-year R&D roadmap. So this is a big piece of work that was done before my time in the office. And it was basically a way of looking at the evidence around what the existing and emerging competitive advantages that we have in New South Wales, what the strategic needs for New South Wales are, what the capabilities are in New South Wales, and really using that as a way of guiding government investment in research and development. It helps to coordinate those activities. It helps to coordinate the research investment and the research activities. It also really importantly helps to send coordinated investment signals out to private industry and capital about where they might invest, where, to align their investment with the way the government's thinking. And really the whole idea of this is to try and highlight where truly disruptive technologies might be that address some of the big challenges that we face. And they can be economic challenges, social, environmental, all the things that I've mentioned along the way so far. And so on the right there, you can see that analysis coalesced into 4 key technology themes: digital, materials and chemistry, energy and biotechnology. And then underneath those was a bunch of more specific aspects of that, where our analysis showed that New South Wales has existing advantages or strengths in these things, but also has strategic needs going forward. And so really a lot of the decision making that we do around where to invest and how we might spend the money that government's interested in investing in research and development is based on this analysis. And if you look at it in a slightly different lens, if you map those 4 technologies there along the left-hand side against the different sectors that exist in the New South Wales economy, you can see there's quite a lot of crossover, but there's also quite a few hotspots where things tend to coalesce. And you can see right in the middle there, underneath healthcare, agri-food, resources and manufacturing, where it crosses with biotechnology and materials and chemistry. I'm going to spend some time in a minute talking about the RNA Research and Development Network in New South Wales, and it fits squarely in that part of the matrix there. So really, I think it's an important point to note that a lot of the things that we do are tied to this strategy, and we often reflect on this strategy when we're making decisions around how to guide investment and around how to support and how best to support R&D in New South Wales. So some of the examples of how we do that research support and how we do that industry development, what we're looking to do is to attract and retain researchers, research infrastructure, and to bring together academia, government, and industry. And it's all about not just commercialization, but translation into, the hands of the citizens, basically. So it's about, improving the well-being and prosperity of citizens. So we do that through various funding schemes. So there's, they all have different names. We provide, direct support. So typical grant funding schemes with specific focus like physical sciences or biosciences. We do work around building and supporting infrastructure, supporting conferences. And then we also do a lot of work supporting networks, bringing industry together with other industry and also with potential customers, both in government and outside of government. There's just a few of the examples that we've currently got running at the moment. These change over time with different government priorities and different policies and things like that, but these are the ones that we're currently looking at. A really important part of what we do is to look at building research networks, innovation networks, commercialization networks. And these are just some of the examples here. And again, you'll see these are aligned with the R&D strategy or the R&D roadmap that I just laid out. And really, these are about driving collaboration. They're really about bringing together different parts of industry and academia together to find solutions to some of the problems. And you can see they cover, smart sensing, semiconductors, defense, space, quantum, decarbonisation, and there's a few others as well. A really good example is one that we ran last year, which is the bushfire response R&D mission. So in response to the 2019 bushfire disaster, the Royal Commission recommended that we should do some work on R&D to help better prepare the state for future bushfires, to use technology, promote industries within New South Wales that would help basically improve our resilience against bushfires. And so we came up, when I say we, this was done before my time, but we came up with basically a mission type approach where we took some funding and put towards a commercialization fund. We ran some pilot programs, which is where, say, National Parks and Wildlife could come and say, well, we've got this problem we need to solve in the way we deal with bushfires. And then we have companies come in and run pilot programs with technology they're developing. We've established a bushfire and natural hazards technology network. So again, this is a way of bringing people together in a room. We've hosted international delegations from France and elsewhere to help them understand what technology we've got available. And then we've also got a bushfire STEM in schools program. So that's a way of helping school kids understand the issues around bushfires, understand bushfire management, and also that feeds back into helping to build their resilience. So you can see that we take this sort of multi-pronged approach, if you like, a coordinated approach to trying to develop these particular aspects of the R&D ecosystem in New South Wales. And before I go on and talk now about the RNA example specifically, I wanted to really highlight the point that we try to make the case as loudly and as often as possible that this is an investment. It's not just spending money for the sake of it. It is actually an investment. And we've started collecting some really interesting data, quite stunning data actually, on the impact that some of our funding is having. So for example, last year, we provided just shy of $47 million in support to R&D and innovation across New South Wales. And we can measure directly in that year that leveraged over $500 million in cash and in-kind contributions from various partners in that program. And we've got pretty good evidence that it's supporting over 700 jobs from that $46 million investment. We can measure a direct attraction of $58 million in investment. And with the example of NCRIS, which is the research infrastructure scheme that we support, tied in with the federal NCRIS program, every dollar that we've invested in that sees a return of about $7 in terms of productivity, innovation, and competitiveness. I talked about the R&D networks that we've supported. And so really it's important when we're talking to government and when you're all talking to government, it's a really good point to keep making, is that this is an investment and that it has an impact. The time frames might be slightly longer than other investments, but really there is a measurable impact. And it's kind of always useful to frame that in terms of policy decision making. So to align that with the way policy is made in government is really important. It's about advanced manufacturing, about supporting skilled jobs and things like that. So that's a point we'd like to try and make loudly and often. And we're sort of continuing to gather data around what works best, what doesn't work, and how we might improve the things that we're already doing. And here's just an example of some of the companies in New South Wales that we've supported through the various programs in the last few years. And some of those might be more familiar to you than others. But we're very rightly proud of the support that we've provided to all of these companies. And some of them are actually now, really flying and getting worldwide attention and attracting significant investment and providing significant jobs, essentially. Okay, so what I wanted to do now is to talk about the work that's going on in the office around helping to support and develop the RNA ecosystem in New South Wales. It's a pretty obvious example to use for the audience today, but it's also one that's close to my heart, having come from, a lot of my research crossed into this field quite closely. And it's also, a large part of the work that's going on is kind of my current responsibility. So I thought it'd be nice to spend some time to talk about this and highlight how this has developed, how we're trying to support it, and also some of the things that we've learned along the way about trying to do this sort of work. So, first and foremost, the impetus for government supporting RNA technology in New South Wales was really highlighted by the COVID pandemic, and particularly in the ability to suddenly and rapidly respond to a threat like an emergent new virus with new technology, with RNA vaccines, essentially. That highlighted the power of the technology, and I think a lot of people probably understood the power of the technology before that, but the sheer impetus of having this pandemic made it a tractable problem, essentially. It also highlighted that we probably have some significant constraints in our ability to produce our own mRNA-based vaccines and therapeutics in Australia, and that's not just an ability to manufacture them, that's also supply chain constraints. It's the sort of thing that gets the attention of government because it points to our ability to underpin our own sovereign capacity. Essentially, we were dependent on elsewhere to have those vaccines, and those vaccines were important in not just saving an awful lot of people's lives, but in keeping our economy afloat. And so there's a very strong interest in developing the RNA ecosystem, and I would say not just in New South Wales. This is happening around Australia and around the world, in fact, and there's some really interesting complementarities and differences in the way different places are going about it. But in New South Wales, the focus is not just on human health, it's also on animal health and agriculture. And so we look at the use of RNA for therapeutics and vaccines and other things, diagnostics, as important for biosecurity, for productivity, and for sovereign capacity. And supporting this ecosystem is also a lot about driving collaboration and about driving research commercialization, which is important for economic activity. It will provide important capacity in advanced manufacturing and in skilled jobs, which are closely aligned to government policy. And we're going about doing that through a multi-pronged approach. So we're supporting the development of a manufacturing facility, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is overseen by an organisation called RNA Australia, and an associated investment program. And then through that, we're also setting up international and national networks and links. So that's the overview, and it comes out of this piece of history, and some of you will be no doubt familiar with this, that, New South Wales and Australia more broadly has a very sort of long, proud and strong history in RNA research, going back all the way to discovery of gene shears in Cairo, all those years ago. And really, that was recognised by the coalescence of this thing called the RNA Production and Research Network in 2021. So it was a sort of a pilot network, if you like, that was set up with 3-year funding of $15 million via the Office of Health and Medical Research, whom we work very closely with, often on lots of projects. And it was a way of bringing together universities and research institutes that had an interest in the development of RNA and associated technologies. And one of the reasons, and again, forgive me for explaining biology to probably quite a few biologists, but one of the reasons that RNA has become so interesting and there is so much, interest in developing it, is really there's a number of different aspects of RNA that make it valuable. There are also a number of different aspects of RNA that have made it traditionally very challenging. And, those of you that have worked with RNA, particularly mRNA, will know how difficult it can be technically to work with. But the combined application of technology to stabilize the mRNA transcript at the same time as some pretty amazing breakthroughs in delivery technology really started to make mRNA-based vaccines particularly, but also now therapeutics a reality. And one of the reasons we really like this, most of the drug targets that currently exist are proteins. A lot of the new therapeutics and emerging therapeutics have been, up until recently, based on making proteins in labs and then using them in bodies as drugs. And essentially, by trying to use RNA as the platform for a therapeutic or a vaccine, you're essentially taking out that really difficult, challenging step of trying to manufacture recombinant protein and just providing the instructions to the cells themselves to do it themselves. And they're much better at doing it than we are in bioreactors and labs. But it really depended on those two technological breakthroughs of delivery and stability. And so the things that make it so attractive are, that it's rapid. It's very easy to dial in the sequence that we need. It's iterable, so it's very easy to make. And we've seen this with COVID vaccines, and we will increasingly see it in things like cancer vaccines and CAR T cell therapies, where it's iterable. It's very easy to change the sequence and the thing that's being targeted or the thing that's trying to be produced. It's also eminently scalable, which is obviously important for getting it to as many people as possible, and it is relatively cheap. So there are a number of aspects of RNA type technology that make it incredibly attractive. And I've already mentioned that, obviously there's been a huge focus on vaccines as the platform of choice for RNA, but we've already moved a long way beyond that. And so, not just in terms of the modalities, so we're not just talking about mRNA or messenger RNA, we're looking at various different forms, both, antisense oligonucleotides, self-activating RNAs, lots of different forms of RNAs, and then different technologies. So whether it's being delivered through lipid nanoparticles, whether it's being used and there's clinical trials going on right now around using CAR T cell therapy that are based on delivering RNAs for cells in the body rather than taking them out and programming them. And really importantly, across a range of indications, so not just in infectious diseases, cardiovascular disease, neurological disease, oncology, and rare and genetic disorders. And really, for a long time, a lot of people have been talking about this promise of personalized medicine or precision medicine. And a lot of what's on this slide represents a key part of realizing that kind of dream, if you like, of precision medicine. RNA-based therapeutic technologies are really framing up squarely as one of the key enablers now of being able to do precision medicine. It's now much more tractable to get from the genetic or genomic information to a workable therapeutic. And so that's one of the other reasons why people are so interested in this. And again, just to reiterate the point, and I'm going to reiterate this because I think it's often lost. We're not just talking about vaccines here. We're talking about diagnostics. We're talking about therapeutics and lots of different applications beyond just infectious diseases. Really importantly, a focus of the work that we're doing in New South Wales is looking at, for example, vaccines for important biosecurity threats to sheep and other animal and livestock populations, and various threats to agriculture, which is not just important from a biosecurity and a food security perspective. They're also major export industries. They employ a lot of people and they generate a lot of economic return for the state. And another thing that I think is often lost in this discussion is around the development of the delivery systems for RNA-based therapeutics and vaccines. And really, when we talk about the RNA ecosystem, we are including delivery technologies, whether that's nanoparticle-based delivery technologies or others. That's a really key part of the work that's going on, both in New South Wales and elsewhere, but that is often kind of lost in these discussions. Okay, so this is what the ecosystem in New South Wales looks like. It's certainly the way we're trying to build it. It's underpinned by the fact that we already have a very strong, diverse and well-recognised research and development ecosystem around RNA in New South Wales. We also have a very well-recognised leading clinical trial system, and that gets a lot of interest from a lot of different biotech and pharma companies. And it also provides an impetus to want to have the ability in New South Wales to manufacture clinical grade material for clinical trials. And so the RNA ecosystem that's emerging in New South Wales, and it's really a collaboration between New South Wales government, and I've got Office of Chief Scientist Engineer on here, but really the OHMR led by Anne O'Neill have really been as instrumental in this as anyone. And so it's very much a collaborative effort, and primary industries through New South Wales Agriculture are also heavily involved in some of this work. And a collaboration with the New South Wales universities through the Bioscience Alliance has led to the development of this thing called RNA Australia, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, which is kind of overseeing a dual-pronged approach, if you like. So we are in the process of the finalising of designs for a new manufacturing and pilot facility that will be built at Macquarie University. And it will be operated by a company called Myeloid Therapeutics, run by a guy called Daniel Getz, who originally graduated from Sydney University, and they're an oncology therapeutics company. And the government, New South Wales government, is providing the capital to build that building. And then Myeloid, Macquarie University, have very generously donated the land to site the facility, and then Myeloid will come in and operate that facility on behalf of the state. Myeloid will use it to generate products for their own clinical trials. But really importantly, that facility will then be open to researchers from not just New South Wales, but anywhere really, to bring their programs, their products and things they want to put into clinical trials into this facility to manufacture. And alongside that manufacturing facility is a significant investment of just over $100 million over 10 years in an R&D investment program. And that's sort of crystallizing at the moment. There'll be a few different aspects to that. Some of it will be around providing training opportunities, not just PhD scholarships, but also importantly, the sort of regulatory and manufacturing skills that need to go with setting up a thing like a GMP manufacturing facility. We're also looking at setting up some sort of venture capital fund to use government money to seed a venture capital fund with private capital, really with the idea of generating spin out opportunities of exploiting the new IP that will come out of these things, with the benefit of all the new products and new technology that will flow to the state. So it's a pretty interesting approach. It's a slightly different way of doing things than the way government might normally do this. And it's really underpinned by this entity called RNA Australia. So RNA Australia was just jointly recently established, and it's a joint venture between the New South Wales universities and New South Wales government. It's a company, it's limited by guarantee by the members, and it's a non-profit. So it will be operated at arm's length from government, but with the key objectives of really supporting the operation of the pilot manufacturing facility, and then developing and supporting the flow, if you like, of products and new research and basic discovery into not just RNA, but into the applications and the delivery technology that goes with it. So it's all about building capacity around getting new therapies, not just in medicine, but also in agriculture. And it's also about improving the accessibility of this technology to academic groups and to other organisations that are developing this kind of work. And it's also about fostering essential skills and pathways for innovation. So, we hope to use the sort of models that, for example, Medical Devices Fund and other programs that have been around for quite a long time to build the capacity for entrepreneurship and commercialization as well. So it's a pretty interesting model. It's a little bit different to what a lot of us are used to seeing. And it really hinges on these kind of four pieces, if you like. So there's the RNA facility, there's the research network, there's the R&D funding and the training that goes with it. So we're really trying to cover as many bases as we can to help develop this ecosystem. And really, the idea is that we get this thing set up and then it will just take on its own life and run. That's the plan anyway. I'm just going to flick through these slides very quickly, sorry, because I wanted to talk about, just with an eye on time, the importance of, getting back to strategy. When we were looking at the business case for doing this work, some of the things we looked at, and this is a good insight, I think, into the way sort of analysis and decision-making around this happens. But, some of the things we looked at was some of the barriers that existed to research and development in RNA. So things like, the high cost associated with it, the low risk appetite or interest by local investors, particularly at early stages, and then looking at the way that we might address that through different mechanisms of funding, through enhancing skills, through enhancing collaboration, facilitating private investment, and then sort of contributing to the pipeline for commercialization, if you like. So it's interesting to think about it in those terms. And it's also interesting to think about how it aligns with various government policies. And I don't really have time to go into that too much. And the other important thing to think through is, something we're spending a lot of time thinking about at the moment, is to try and understand where the most useful application of this funding is going to be and where the biggest unmet need is, I guess. So, through the development pipeline or timeline of a new therapeutic or a new diagnostic, there are points of market failure, I guess, where it's very difficult to get things through that sort of middle phase of preclinical into early clinical development. And so we're looking at different ways where it's the most productive use of government funding alongside private capital. We don't really want to be competing with private capital. We want to try and address where there are points of market failure. So we're trying to be, again, as strategic as possible about where the various arms of this ecosystem development work that we're doing will fit within that pipeline and that timeline. And I thought it would be good to just to reflect actually on some of the opportunities and challenges, I guess, that I've learnt about in the last little while working on this program, where we're really trying to bring together academia, industry, and government, with citizens sitting squarely in the middle there, getting back to the raison d'etre of what we do here around really working to benefit the citizens of New South Wales and obviously Australia more broadly, but not just through their health, but also through economic prosperity and environmental and social prosperity. And I think it's interesting to reflect on some of the things that have brought this program together. $200 million is not an insignificant amount of government investment. And I think, one thing that's clear is there was a very clear and present threat, which was a very strong impetus for bringing this together. The COVID pandemic really crystallized thinking on how this could work. I think what backed that up was a really remarkable level of collaboration and cooperation from all of the different universities and institutes and all of the different researchers working in this space. And I think it's not something we often do well in Australia in particular, is that cooperative and collaborative approach. We're often working against each other. And there were clearly some synergies and complementarities around the various bits of work that were going on in Australia already. Whether it was on applications, whether it was on delivery technology or understanding the basic biology of RNA to start with a very clear impact of some of this work. And, that impact was really clearly demonstrated with COVID vaccines, and it's now starting to really be shown with some of the work that's going on in oncology and elsewhere. Some of the challenges that exist when you're trying to pull together this sort of landscape are competing needs. Academics have certain performance metrics and certain motivations, industry and government, and they're not always pulling in the same direction. They can be pulling in very different directions sometimes, and sitting in the middle trying to align those and navigate those can be quite challenging, along with the various vagaries and details around IP and what happens to IP. That can be quite a challenge and quite a barrier. Also, shifting context and funding certainty. You know, governments change, government priorities change, fiscal environments change. That can be quite a challenge as well. And a really interesting one, the last 2 points there around risk appetite and pace. The pace that these different sectors operate at and the risk appetite that these different sectors hold can be quite a point of contention and can make it quite difficult to get them to work together. And that's been a really interesting space for me to work in the last little while, is to try and bring those different arms together, get them talking the same language, get them to understand each other's risk appetites, and get them to understand that, you know, if you're a biotech company, things might not move as fast in government, for example, as they do in the world of biotech and venture capital. And so that's been quite an interesting challenge as well. Okay, so I'll just leave you with this one message, and you know, obviously I'm beating you over the head with this, but I think it's an important one and it's worth making, right? Is that supporting research is an investment. It's not just about bench to bedside. It's about developing the entire ecosystem. It's the people that work in the ecosystem. It's the infrastructure. It's the pipelines to commercialization. And that's because this research underpins not just our health, but our wealth, our security, our environment, and our social conditions. And I think a really nice way to think about it, or a sort of really nice framing context, is that this, you know, is that supporting this research and building these ecosystems is really all about building resilience against future threats. And, you know, we don't really know what those threats might even be, but having a thriving, healthy R&D system in New South Wales gives us the ability to respond to those threats when they happen. And really, it's all about improving productivity and standards of living and quality of life. And I think if we keep that central to the way we think, then we, you know, it sort of makes the case by itself, really. And I'm conscious I want to leave room for questions, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks, Jenny, and I'll hand back to you.
Fantastic, Darren. That was amazing. I loved it. I just managed to take a photo of that last slide, and I did think, you know, coming back to your interest in being, you know, the ocean and stuff, I can imagine with a role where you've got so many things to think about and juggle, you must find getting out into the ocean probably a really great way of just grounding yourself and seeing things from that different perspective.
It's a good point. It's really important actually to keep that the big picture. It's very easy to get lost in the weeds with this sort of thing, and you have to be across the detail, but I think it's very important to keep that big picture. And the thing I've found really interesting and really rewarding is that understanding things that work in completely different sectors or completely different industries to the ones I've ever had anything to do with, and understanding how they might come across and work in things that are closer to home for me, and vice versa, is a really interesting insight. And getting to work with an amazing team of people that have all that different expertise is also really fun from that perspective. Yeah.
I can imagine. If anyone has a question for Darren, please pop up your hand. I'll call on you. We do have a bit of time. I thought, look, I've got a ton of questions, but I might start with, I suppose maybe one, the thing that, you know, you talked about the 20-year plan for R&D in New South Wales, and obviously people have, you know, you need plans and long-term planning is good, but I wanted to get your views on how some of the really potentially disruptive things over the last year, like AI, how do you how do those plans retain relevance when you have these things happening that could have such hugely disruptive effects and also over such short time frames?
Yep, I think that's an excellent question. There's a few different ways of dealing with it. One, we try not to be too prescriptive in that sort of R&D analysis. So, you know, it's deliberately kind of broad picture approach, and it says, you know, here's the things that we have existing capacity, but also strategic need. It's also about adapting it as things move along. So, you know, I showed the example there very briefly of the decarbonisation innovation report that we've done a couple of versions of now, and it was really interesting to see how the technology, really that report is a survey of technology. It's like, what is the current state of the art in various technologies around decarbonisation, and whether that's in energy generation, whether it's in transport, whether it's in infrastructure, synthetic fuels, whatever that might be. It was really amazing to see how far that technology has changed and how far the different use cases have changed just in a 2-year window. So things that we thought 2 or 3 years ago were going to be the next huge thing or the next big disruptive technology turn out probably might not be those disruptive technologies, and there's new things that have come along now. And so that's instructive in itself in how to deal with that. So I think you need to be adaptive and you need to constantly reflect. but it always needs to be based in evidence. I think that's something we always hammer home here.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer.